A lot of people ask me to do a compositing tutorial for Blender after I've released my free compositing pack MP-Comp, so here it is. This is the first video of a whole tutorial series, which will consist out of 4 videos. Each of them can also be watched on their own, as all of them are dedicated to cover one specific area of the compositor. Though by watching all of them, you will learn about all the capabilities and limitations of Blender and its compositor. This video here will focus on how to set up and use the compositor and how to apply some basic color correction and simple post-processing effects. The other videos will cover more advanced tasks like masking, tracking and the creation of your own custom effects. Be aware that these tutorials are in depth, which means I will not only show you how to do things, but will also cover why you should do something in a certain way and also provide the technical knowledge that I think is mandatory. Still, to keep the tutorial shorter and easier to follow, I will provide example files, so we already start with a scene that we can use for the compositing and don't have to model anything from scratch. You can just download them for free from my Ko-fi store. Blender currently has 3 different methods to use the compositor. Still, all of them work by using the compositing editor, which you can assign to any window inside Blender using this dropdown. The big difference between the different methods is how you preview the composited result. On one hand, we have the traditional way of using the compositor, which works by having the preview within the backdrop of the compositing editor and using the image editor. It's the most stable integration of the compositor, since this is where all the other methods originate from, but its preview capabilities are limited as you will have a short processing delay when moving to another frame in your timeline, which makes it pretty hard to animate different effects in the compositor, as you can't reliably preview the timings of your animation. This is where the Realtime compositor of Blender comes into place, which will show its preview right in the 3D viewport of Blender. The Realtime compositor is the fastest method to preview Blender's compositor, as it is pretty much real-time even under quite heavy conditions. Also, you won't have to re-render each frame of a 3D scene like you would have to in the traditional compositor. So you can also get a real-time preview of the compositing being applied to an animated 3D scene. The biggest downside of it, however, is that your preview might differ from your final result when exporting it. This is because the compositor will output the image in the resolution the preview is taking up on your screen. The actual render result, however, will use the resolution you specify in the output properties. But a lot of the compositor's effects work in pixels, so if you would have a rectangle and move it by 100 pixels, it can either look like an insignificant change or move completely out of bounds. However, this is solvable by using Blender's relative to pixel node, which I will further showcase and explain in another entry of the series, but I found it crucial for you to know about this type of behavior, as it could cause frustration and confusion otherwise. Now to the final entry of this list, there is the relatively new VSE compositor, which allows you to use the compositor in Blender's video sequencer. This expands the sequencer by the compositor's complexity and also benefits the compositor, as you have a more intuitive preview and also have the ability to cache the compositor for a lag-free preview. Currently, this method is still lacking GPU acceleration, which is a shame since the compositor benefits a lot from it when using the alternative methods, but it is a planned feature to be added. But that's the reason why this series currently won't focus on the VSE compositor. Nonetheless, you will be able to apply the knowledge taught in this video to all of the available compositors. So this is the example scene we are going to use in this tutorial, which I've created by using assets from Polyhaven. This scene is provided in the previously mentioned download, so just open that and follow along. Of course, you can also use one of your own scenes, but for following along I would recommend using the example at least for the first time. As you can see when switching into the rendered shading, it features a lantern sitting on a tree stump in a slightly foggy forest. It doesn't look too bad, but there's definitely a lot of unused potential here, as the colors are looking rather flat and muted. So let's use the compositor to apply a color correction to it to fix that. We are going to use the Realtime compositor for that. So we drag from one of the corners here to pull up a new window, set it to the compositing editor, and create a new node group by clicking here. The reason why I'm calling it node group and not node tree is because since Blender 5.0, the compositing setups are saved as node groups, so you can easily switch between different compositing setups for a scene. Now, to enable the real-time preview of the compositor, we will have to expand this drop-down next to the shading icons. We can set it to either be disabled, be only applied while being inside the camera view, or to be always applied within this instance of the 3D viewport. Like if we set it to always and then add an exposure node to the compositor, we can see our adjustments of it being applied in real time. If we set it to camera, however, we will no longer be able to see the changes as long as we're outside of the camera view. So if we switch back to the camera view, the compositing will be previewed as expected. I recommend setting the preview to camera as the real-time compositor is being rendered in the resolution the preview takes up on your screen. So setting the preview to always can become really performance intense when doing complex compositing setups. This also means that the resolution of your display and the size of the viewport influences the performance of the real-time compositor. For example, the preview will require more resources when working in 4K rather than 1080p, and zooming out or resizing the window of the viewport will increase the performance as it displays the preview in a lower resolution. Also, when opening the sidebar of the compositor, you should switch the device that is used for the compositing to GPU, as it is a lot faster than doing it over the CPU. In our case, this will only influence the performance of the compositing when actually rendering our scene using F12, as the real-time compositor will always use the GPU. But you might have noticed that changing it to GPU exposed another setting called precision. And for basic compositing, it probably won't make a visual difference whether it is set to auto or full, but when using textures or a lot of math nodes, it can. So I would recommend setting it to full, as running into an issue caused by using the wrong precision can cause some frustrating troubleshooting. But going back to our exposure node here, you might have already noticed that by lowering the exposure, we are able to recover some details we couldn't see before within the brightest part of the lantern. This is possible because we're working in a linear color space and also have full access to the raw color data of our render. Linear color space means that if you would aim two equally bright lights at the same point, the brightness of both lamps will be added together, which is accurate to real-world behavior, and we are able to accurately use math on the render's brightness. Like if you would divide the brightness by 2, every brightness level will become half as bright. The disadvantage of that is that we as humans don't perceive brightness linearly, so the contrast of a linear render might look off or appear too dark. This is where what we call a view transform comes into play, which maps those linear colors into colors which look correct on our displays. In Blender, we can configure that in our render properties by scrolling to the bottom and expanding the color management panel. By default, it is set to AGX. By changing it to raw, we can actually disable the view transform. And there you can see how the image appears way too dark, and that a lot of the limited amount of different brightness levels our monitors can display is wasted by using a lot of it on the very bright parts of the image. Our monitors display color in RGB, and each of those channels can range from off to on, which we can express as a range of 0 to 1. And since the brightness in our linear color space is added together, like I've mentioned earlier, it doesn't take much brightness for our render to go beyond a value of 1. And view transforms like AGX will map our linear brightness levels, which can range from 0 to infinity, into this much smaller range of 0 to 1. And the default AGX view transform works perfectly when using cycles and doing our post-processing in Blender using the compositor. But there is a trade-off. Let me demonstrate what I mean by drag and dropping this image of a rainbow gradient in our compositor and connecting it to our output. Then I will add a scale node and set it to render and fit. Now, if I simply open the image file and compare it to our preview in Blender, you can see that the colors look less saturated and muted in Blender. This is because the view transform is applied after the compositor is being processed. So we now have the view transform also applied on this rainbow image. But we can fix this by setting the view transform to standard, which will bring our image into our display's color space without applying any tone mapping, so our image will display correctly. But if we switch back to use our render in cycles as the output, you can see we lost some detail in the brightest area of our lantern. This happens because the standard view transform will simply cut off any brightness level that goes beyond a level of 1. It still fixes the issue of our image looking too dark, but we're losing some visual details due to clipping, which makes all of those bright areas that exceed the display color space be the same brightness. So what options do we have? We could either just stay on a view transform like AGX, or since the compositor is applied before the view transform, we can stay on standard and just apply our view transform exclusively to the 3D render of our scene. To do so, we can use Blender's new Convert to Display node, which we can set to AGX to get the tone mapping we're used to when working with Blender. But since this result will also still be tone mapped by our view transform, which is set to standard, we will have to place another Convert to Display node, set it to standard, and then check the invert toggle. And this is the entire setup we need for our render to benefit from the tone mapping of AGX, while still being able to see our external footage like intended. Now, every color grading element for our 3D scene will go in between both Convert to Display nodes, and all the external images will be added after those nodes. Sometimes you might want your external media to also be affected by some of the color grading, where in this case you will just have to set the color space of the image node to working space. And as you can see, when plugging it into the inverse Convert to Display node, it will display correctly. Okay, so let's start with our actual color correction. First, make sure you have Node-Wrangler enabled. You can find it under the preferences in Blender and then going to add-ons. It already ships with Blender, so just type in Node into this search bar and then make sure this checkbox next to Node-Wrangler is ticked. This will just add a few useful hotkeys to our node editors in Blender. So now we're going to add a new node using Shift A. And under the color panel, you will find pretty much everything that is relevant for color correction. And I usually like to start with a color balance node, which is right here. And this color balance node allows us to add colors to the shadows, midtones, and highlights of our renders. Like by hovering over the lift color, you can see that it says correction for shadows. So lift is for shadows, gamma is for midtones, and gain is for highlights. I usually like to start with the shadows, so we're going to open up the color from the lift panel, and I usually like to add a slight blue tint to it. So we're gonna select a blue hue, and then increase the saturation. As you can see, the node is rather sensitive, so you usually want to only operate within the first half of the saturation so you don't overdo it. And you can also use the sliders down here if you feel like it gives you more control over how the colors look. So yeah, just experiment a bit with different hues and saturations until you get a result you find pleasant. Then we also not only have a color for each tonal range, but also a slider, which kind of controls the brightness of each tonal range. So we can use this to bring up the brightness of the shadows or to further decrease it. Again, this is rather sensitive, so I would recommend you to hold the Alt key while dragging the values, which will lower the increment you're adjusting the slider in. So I'm slightly decreasing the brightness of the shadows, and then I'm going to move on to the midtones. For the midtones, I think that really a lot of different hues can work. So let's just add a bit of saturation. And as you can see, green kind of works for the forest atmosphere. Orange kind of hue makes the whole image appear warmer. And the blue hues make it look more like a night scene. So yeah, this completely comes down to your creative decision. I think I like this hue range the most, something between yellow and green. And then I'm going to adjust the saturation. Again, we can control the brightness of the midtones, where it also really comes down to what you think looks good as an artistic decision. There aren't really much rules here. I would just add that increasing the brightness too much will end up in the image losing a lot of contrast. So I usually like to be close to the original 1.0 setting and just make only very slight adjustments. Now for our highlights, which are the brightest parts of the image, I usually like to adjust the slider first instead of the color, so I can see what I can expect when it comes to the brightness of the highlights, especially when we have a scene like this where a bright light is our focal point. So I will slightly increase the brightness of that. And then I'm going to add a bit of a warm color to it to make the scene look a bit cozier. For the highlights, I usually use only very low saturation, as otherwise you will just drown the entire image in that color. And now if we compare the results of that node with our initial render by muting the node by pressing M, you can see that it already made a huge difference when it comes to the colors of our render. One more thing I want to mention about the color balance node is that it has multiple modes. So if you duplicate it by pressing Shift D, you can see that we have a menu here where it says lift gamma gain, which we can expand by clicking on it. And then we can select between different modes. Offset power slope is very similar to the lift gamma gain mode, but it used to be the only way to use this node in a linear color space. But nowadays, the lift gamma gain node also works perfectly fine in linear space, so I don't really use that mode that much. But the other mode of the node, which is the white point node, is very interesting as it is effectively a white balance. Like if you would adjust the temperature in the output panel, you can see that the image will get warmer, or if we go into the other direction, the image will get cooler. And using this tint value, we can switch between green and purple coloring. And by using this eyedropper tool, we can also do a proper white balance. So if we reset this node by selecting it, hovering over it, and then hitting backspace, it will reset to its default settings. So we have to go into the white point menu again. And then if we click that and select a white part of the image, or a part that should be white and currently isn't, you can see that the values automatically adjusted so that we get a more neutral look in our render. I personally think it could be more intuitive to use, which is why in my compositing pack MP-Comp I actually made a more accessible option for that, which is called MP White Balance. And there you have an easier, more artistic friendly control without having to scroll into infinite values. Remember to check out MP-Comp, it's completely free with no strings attached. But we're gonna delete this for now. And another thing that I want to mention is that if you ever get confused what a node exactly does in Blender, you can actually quickly check the documentation of Blender by right-clicking a node and then hitting Online Manual. This will open up the documentation page for that node right in your browser. And this is actually pretty useful, as sometimes some of the terminology used here can be whether abstract or hard to understand. So I actually use this feature quite frequently whenever I feel like I don't really understand what a node does. But I'm going to hop back into Blender for now. And I think our next step should be to adjust the brightness and contrast of our image. And we could do that by using the exposure node from earlier. or the hue saturation value node, or the bright and contrast node. But there is a node that gives us a lot more control, which is called the color correction node. So we're just going to add this, and then we have a few different panels we can expand where we can control the saturation, contrast, gamma, gain, and offset of the entire image, the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. One thing about the offset value I want to mention is that you have to be really careful with it when using negative values, because as you can see when I slide this down, you will get false colors, because this value is basically subtracted from the image. And if you go below a value of 0, this is what happens. You get those weird inverted colors. So if you use this value, I would recommend to only use positive values for it. But what we actually care about are the saturation and contrast values here. I usually like to play around with the saturation of the highlights first, as this one can be quite tricky to get right. And then I usually adjust the brightness of the highlight by using the gain, gamma, and contrast slider. And my workflow for this is balancing the amount of visible detail by using the contrast, and then recovering the lost brightness by using the gain slider. So we get a few of the reflections of the glass visible, while also having the light look intense. And for the midtones and shadows, I also usually like to play around with the saturation, contrast, and maybe the gamma value. When increasing the saturation of the midtones, you can easily get a very overstimulating result, but sometimes depending on the scene, this can create a really cool look. But in this case, I think, yeah, I will only slightly increase it. Then I'm going to add a bit of contrast. And then I will move on to the shadows. So I think this looks nice. I will mute this node again by using M to check the before and after version. Yeah, I think it looks nicer with the color correction node. But what our scene currently is still lacking, I think, is a proper glow effect, which we can achieve by using Blender's glare node. So just hit Shift A, search for glare, and insert it right here. This node has a lot of different modes we can use, which we can cycle through by using this menu here. Right now we are not seeing an effect at all, which is because we first have to configure the threshold of the effect. So basically this will determine at which brightness level the effect starts appearing. Currently it is set that all pixels that are brighter than the value of 1 are affected by the effect. So if you lower this threshold, we will see the effect being more present. Right now it is set to streaks, which if we further adjust the fade value down here, you can see that it will add some linear light streaks to the brightest parts of our image. I'm gonna adjust the threshold a bit again. Yeah, there we can see it. And another important thing about this is the quality of the effect, which you can control by using this menu here, which currently says medium. What this actually does is it controls the resolution the effect itself is outputted at. And since our scene isn't really that heavy currently, since we are working on a still frame, I will bump that up to high, which will output the effect at the full resolution of our render. But I actually want to use a different mode than streaks for this. And what you will notice when we switch the mode to, let's say, bloom, is that it will only affect the settings within the glare panel of the effect. The highlights, clamp, and adjust panel will always stay the same. So I will focus on explaining them. The clamp panel here, which we can expand and check to enable, will make sure that our glare effect won't exceed a certain brightness. Currently it is set to only output a maximum brightness of 10, but if you still remember, our view transform takes care of that by simply cutting that off. So we don't have to worry about that. Then in the adjust panel, you can adjust the strength of the actual glow effect, which is basically just the opacity of the effect itself on the render. And what I usually like to do with this is that I click into it and then enter a value like 10 to overshoot it. And as you can see, it actually helps increasing the brightness of the entire effect. But I'm going to lower it a bit. So now we have the saturation and the tint value. Actually, those two are unrelated, as the saturation will just define how much of the colors of the original colors will be visible in the glow. Like if we set it to 0, you will see that the glow effect will become pure white, instead of containing some colors of the image when we set it to a saturation of 1. The tint, on the other hand, will just colorize the glow effect in a color you can define here. So we can have a red glow, green glow, basically any color you want. But I'm going to leave this on white for now. By the way, you can also reset individual values by hovering over the color panel here and then hitting backspace. So it will only reset this single value instead of the entire node. But I think for this scene, I'm going to use the ghost glare, which is basically simulating a lens flare effect. Let me further demonstrate this by playing around with the threshold. Actually, we can also use the different outputs here to only preview the glare. And we will use Node-Wrangler for that by holding down Ctrl-Shift and then left-clicking the node, which will add a viewer node here. And then we're going to left-click again. We're still holding Ctrl and Shift. So the glare output is connected to the viewer node. So this is the output we're currently seeing here. And this is only the glow effect without being blended with the input image, which is pretty useful for monitoring or further using it in your composition with different blend modes, etc. So as you can see, it will basically create repetitions from the center of our image, and we can also increase the amount of iterations down here, so the effect has less visible steps in it. Like when having it on the lowest value, you can actually see how the brightest area of the image are being repeated here. And the color modulation will just add a bit of rainbowy colors to the whole glow effect. So I'm just going to play around a bit with that until I'm satisfied with it. Then going to our reroute here, which is added by default, and hitting Ctrl-Shift left click on it, so we can view our final result again, and then make the fine-tune adjustments. I think with the glow effect, the highlights are coming off a bit too strong, so I will go back to the color correction node and take a bit of gain from the highlights to make them less bright. I think this looks good, but since our scene basically has a light as its main object, I'm going to add another glare node, so I will just duplicate this, but I will set it to sunbeams this time. And this is adding a very streaky glow, which you can control the center point of by using the sun position value here. The first value is the X position on the image, with 1 being the very right of the image and 0 the very left. And the bottom value is the Y coordinate of our screen space, so setting it to 0 will place it at the bottom, and setting it to 1 will place it at the top. So I just place it into the center of our lantern and then configure the different settings for it again. I will also set the size to 1. Also gonna readjust the gain again and maybe add a slight orange tint to it. If you're wondering about the jitter value at the bottom, it's basically a setting to get better performance, because if you increase it, the streaks will become noisier and also at very high levels get visual glitches, as you can see, at the benefit of getting better performance. But in our case, we can leave it on 0. So yeah, you can experiment with different glow effects and play around with them until you get a result you're satisfied with. Just make sure you get kinda comfortable with using the glare node, as it is a quite frequently used node in Blender. Okay, so this is our color correction setup for now. What we're going to do next is add a lens overlay, which I'll provide within the download. So just drag and drop that into the compositor. And if you preview that again with Node-Wrangler by using Ctrl-Shift-left click, we can see our image. But what you will notice when zooming in the viewport is that the crop or size of our image is changing. And this is a limitation of the real-time compositor. But we can work around this by adding a scale node by using Shift-A and then setting it from relative to render size. This will automatically make our image fit within the specified resolution. And as you can see when zooming out, it will stay in a fixed position. And after setting it to render size, you will get 3 different modes you can select, which define how the image is being fit into the render view. Currently it is set to stretch, which will just stretch the image so it fits into the viewport. Then we have fit, which won't stretch the image, but also won't make it cover the entire screen if it isn't in the same aspect ratio. And then we have crop, which will just proportionally scale the image without stretching it until it fits the entire canvas. By the way, you can use any overlay you like. This is something I got from FreePic, but you can also use one from sites like Pixabay, Pexels, etc. And then we merge the result of our convert to display node. And for this, we will just need a mix color node. So you're going to add this by using Shift-A, searching mix, and then adding the mix color node here. Then we're gonna drop it into this connection here. So the output of our convert to display node is connected to the A input. And then we're going to connect the scale node to the B input. Then we're going to switch back the preview to our result by hitting Ctrl-Shift-left click on the reroute here. And there we can see that the overlay is merged with our result. We can control the opacity by using this factor here. But as you can see, we can only switch between our lantern being visible or our overlay being visible. And we can get a nicer result by playing with different blend modes, which we can find by clicking on the mix menu here and then choosing one of the different blend modes. In our case, I think the add blend mode should do well here. There we go, looks much nicer, and we don't get any dark colors of our overlay mixed into our result. Now to something more complex. We're going to make the overlay's visibility depend on the brightness of our image, just like it would be with a real camera. To do so, we will use our image of the lantern as a mask for our factor input here. In order to do that, we can either use a map range node or a color ramp node. The benefit of the map range node is that it has input sockets, so we can create procedural setups with it or use them as inputs for node groups. But since we are not needing those benefits right now, we can just delete that and focus on the benefit of the color ramp, which is its intuitive usability. So I'm just going to input the convert to display output into our color ramp and then preview this again. And we can see our image being converted to black and white since we have connected a color output to a float input. And within the compositor of Blender, this will just use the luminance of the image. So we now have a representation of the different brightness levels of our image. And by using these stops here within the color ramp, we can further adjust that map we want to use as a mask. So anything that will be black means that the overlay won't get added at all. Anything that is white means that the overlay will be visible at full strength, and the grays will achieve opacity in between. So by pulling this first stop further to the right, we can expand the dark areas of our image to kinda lower the sensitivity of that effect. And we're playing around with the second stop. We can control how strong our overlay will be visible overall. So let's preview what it will look like. So we're going to set our preview back here and then connect the color output here to the vector input of our mix node. And as you can see, we only have a few spots of our overlay visible and they gather around the brightest part of our image. So let's further adjust this. Okay, so I think like this it kind of works. Next up, we're going to add a few camera effects and we're going to start with a vignette. And the easiest way to create one is probably by just using the new preset nodes that ship with Blender 5.0 and later, which we can just pull up from here. And if we just plug that into here, you can see that we easily get a vignette, and we can further customize it by using these controls within this node group. So this is probably the method I would recommend, but for the sake of this tutorial, I am going to show you two ways of how you could create your own vignette effect. So I'm going to unplug this node for now, and I will start by showing you the old method of how vignettes were created in the compositor. So back then, you would just have added an ellipse mask, which if we preview that, you can see just creates an elliptical mask. And if we would use that with another mix node, which we set to the mix blending mode again, we can connect the mask to the vector input of it, reconnect this output to the bottom input, and then change this color to black. So now we can use the size controls here to create a circular cutout, but in order for it to actually look more like a vignette, we would have to create a fall-off of this mask, and you would usually do so by using a blur node, which we can just add right here. And then we're going to hold left click, drag it down so we have both values selected, and then bump that up. And as you can see, we are starting to get a fall-off effect. And the reason why it is a legacy method is because it has two disadvantages. The first one is that the size of the blur is defined in pixels, which for our real-time compositor here means that the size of the preview will control the strength of the blur. So we would have a hard time actually monitoring the strength of the blur. And the second disadvantage is that stronger fall-offs will increasingly eat up more performance, as blur effects can't really be performed in a parallel way, which our GPUs usually benefit from, as the blur effect works by averaging out the color of neighboring pixels. So it has to work in a kind of serialized way so it can correctly perform the operation. So what we can do instead is just using a gradient texture. So I'm going to delete both of those nodes and then add a gradient texture, plug the effect of it into the vector input, and this will give us this result. Since if we preview the gradient, we can see that it starts at the center of the image and then falls off toward the right edge of the image. But if we set the gradient from linear to spherical, we will get a fall off from the center of the image towards all of the edges of the image. And if we now preview the final result, you can see that we have a vignette effect again. Now to control the fall off, we can just add another color ramp node. And then if we would move the right stop further to the left stop, you would get a harsher fall off. So if we would move both of these stops close to each other, we get a really sharp fall off. And if we move them further away, we will get a smoother fall off. And to control the scale of the vignette, we can just play around with the texture mapping of the gradient texture, just like you would in the shader editor with the mapping node. but it works a bit differently in the compositor, as we would first have to add an image coordinate node. And by using this node, we can create texture coordinates from the dimensions or resolution of an input image. So if we input our composited lantern into here, and then input the uniform output into the vector input of the gradient texture, you can see that the vignette still looks the same, as by default all textures in the compositor will be mapped by using the screen space, and since our render is in the same resolution as our screen space, it will basically get the same result. Now if we would switch that to normalized or pixel, we actually get different results. So the setup is working properly. But the reason we added this node now, even though it isn't changing anything currently, is because we can now further modify the texture mapping by using vector math. So we can just add a vector math node, and then we're going to drop it right here. And if you would now play around with these values, we can actually already move the vignette. So basically the first value represents the x-axis, and the second value represents the y-axis, and the third value represents the z-axis, which will just kinda transform the scale. But to get more control of the scale, we can just change the vector math node from add to divide, then hold left click and drag over all of these values, enter 1 and hit enter, which will give us our initial result again. And now we can control the scale of the vignette on each axis, which gives us the option to utilize different aspect ratios for our vignette. We could also use the multiply mode of the vector math node, but I don't find it as intuitive, as increasing the value will make the vignette smaller and decreasing it will make it bigger, as with the divide mode, decreasing the value makes it smaller and increasing the value makes it bigger, which I think feels more intuitive to use. So we just set that to a scale that looks pleasant to us. Then I'm going to move the stop of the color ramp further to the left so we get a slightly harsher fall off. And then I will move the left stop of the color ramp further to the right so the vignette starts a bit earlier. Okay, so we're done with our vignette. For the next step, we're going to add film grain to our scene. But since we already get a bit of noise from our render through cycles, I would recommend rendering it first with denoising activated, so it's easier for us to monitor the look of our film grain. So I'm just going to switch to the rendering tab right here, so the real-time preview doesn't eat up any additional performance. And the denoising should already be activated and configured like that in the scene I gave you. So I will just hit F12 and wait for a while. Okay, so it finished rendering, took about 30 seconds, so I'm going to switch back to the layout working space. And now to actually use the rendered image, we will have to drag another window right here, which we will set to the image editor. Then we're going to open up the render result, and there we have our rendered image. So right now we're basically using both the real-time compositor and the traditional compositor at the same time. So if I would move to the next frame in the timeline by hitting the right arrow key, we now have this progress bar at the bottom, which indicates the progress of the traditional compositor. So even though this is quite useful for monitoring, as you can also sample the colors by holding left click and looking at the bottom, it also eats up more performance as long as this editor is opened. So if you would want to switch back to exclusively working with the real-time compositor, we can just close this window again. So we have more performance we can spend on the real-time compositor instead of having to let Blender distribute the performance among the real-time and the traditional compositor. So now to our film grain, We could again use one of Blender's new pre-made nodes for this, which would be this sensor noise node group, which we can just plug in here. And then we could play around with the sliders to add noise, and also have a checkbox which we can use to make the noise animated. Since, as you can see, if we move a few frames again, the noise will be static. But if we check the animated toggle here, it will use a kind of different noise on each frame. So this is one method, but again, I'm also going to show you how to do it manually. So we're going to reconnect this again, and then add a noise texture node. Then we will duplicate the mix color node again, so we can add the noise. And now we can decide whether we want monochromatic noise or colored noise by using the different outputs of the noise texture node. And in this case, I will use the vector output, so the black and white noise. But currently it isn't really looking like film grain. So what we have to do is we have to increase the scale of our noise texture node by using the value right here and increasing that. And now it already looks closer to an actual film grain. But as you might have noticed already, it brightens up our image a lot. And to fix this, we can just use a different blend mode for our mix node. And I usually like to use the soft light blend mode for this. But you can also experiment with other blend modes like linear light or overlay. But I'm going to leave it on soft light for now. And then we can further adjust the different parameters of the noise texture node. So we already set up the scale value. Next would be the detail value, which will just control how many iterations of the noise will be used, which also means that a higher value will require more performance. So keep that in mind for the texture nodes. But at the current scale of our noise texture, we will not really see a lot of differences when increasing this number anyway, so we can just leave it on 2. Now the roughness value will just control the opacity of each new iteration. So by increasing this value, we will get a finer noise effect. And those 3 values are basically the only ones you will need for the sake of adding film grain, so you don't have to care about the bottom 2 values right now. But if you would now move to another frame in our timeline again, you can see that our noise is static, which in our case is okay since we're not doing an animation, but I will still quickly show you how you would animate the noise. And we won't need any keyframes for that, as we will just add a scene time node, which will just output a different value over time. So if we would set the noise texture from 3D to 4D, we would get a new W parameter, which kind of works like a different seed or evolution for the texture. So if we would set this to another value, we would simply get another pattern for the noise. So we could just use the frame output and connect it there. And if we now move to another frame in our timeline, you can see that our film grain is animated. But since our film grain is being applied only in 2D, having a 4D texture is kinda overkill. So if you would like to save a bit of performance, we could set it back to 3D, then use the uniform input from our image coordinates node and connect it to the vector input. Then we will duplicate the vector math node and set it to add. And as I showed you previously with the gradient texture, this lets us move the texture on the X and Y axis and also the Z axis. And since the Z axis isn't really utilized in our setup right here, we can just use it for our animation. But since we can't input our frame value here into the Z axis individually, we will have to use a combined XYZ value first. and then connect the frame output only to the Z input of that. And now we move a few frames in our timeline. You can see that we get the same effect of an animated film grain without having to rely on adding a new dimension to the node. Okay, so much for our film grain. Now for our final step, we're going to add a lens distortion effect. So we're just going to add the node of the same name called lens distortion, add it after our vignette, and then by adjusting the distortion, we can apply a barrel distortion to our image, which we can use to create field of view or fisheye effects. But as you can see, when increasing it too much, we will get some transparent edges here. And to fix that, we will just have to check the fit toggle on the lens distortion node, which will automatically scale the image so it fills out the entire canvas. And right now this is a very strong distortion effect. I usually like to only apply a very slight distortion effect. So usually I use something below 0.1 or greater than negative 0.1. And yeah, this will just make the image look more like it has been shot with an extra camera instead of being a 3D render, and adds a bit of slight visual interesting imperfection to our image. Then we also have the dispersion value, which will add some chromatic aberration, which will split the colors of the image into red, green, and blue, depending on how far they are located from the center of the image. Again, I usually only use very slight values for that. And yeah, I think this looks nice. And now we have our finished result. And to see how far we've come, we can just use the image editor and switch from the composited result to view layer, which will output the raw render. And then we can switch back and just cycle through them to see that our composited result looks a lot nicer. And the cool thing about the Realtime compositor is that we can still modify our 3D scene by adding new objects or changing the position of the camera while seeing the effects of our composition being applied in real time. So yeah, I'm also going to upload the finished .blend file of this tutorial so you can open it for yourself and compare it with your own version or learn from the finished result. So all that's left to do for you is to submarine to the channel so you don't miss the next videos of this series. I hope you found this video helpful. See you next time.